Right, so for this panel, we're going to be talking about big blocks and what to do about big blocks. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Antony. I currently work at MetaMask on the transactions team. We take care of simulations and smart transactions. What we really care about is user inclusion, specifically around how long it takes a transaction to land on chain. So we've got a bunch of data that we keep an eye on things, and we've observed some interesting things, let's say, about what happens when blocks are full or not full. I'll pass it over to Terence to introduce himself.
Hello, I am Terence. I am a Consensys dev. I work on Prysm, the Consensys layer client. At the same time, my employer is Offchain Labs, so they are also a service provider for Arbitrum. So I'm kind of in between this, like, in between mates between layer 1 and layer 2. Yeah, so hopefully I can provide some insights here.
Cool. Hey everyone, Murat. I'm founder and CEO at Primev. We have a credible commitment network, real-time commitments across chains. People are notably using it for pre-confirmations today. Happy to add some insights about real-time differences between big blocks and real-time nature of commitments.
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm Michael. I'm head of research at Course One. We are node operator. We might have kicked off the timing game's prisoner's dilemma for other node operators, so apologies for that. Also slightly late because I had a panel before, so maybe that's a lesson about timing games. But in any case, glad to be here.
Hey everyone, I'm Matt. I'm founder and CEO of Blocknative. We build core real-time infrastructure for largely the Ethereum ecosystem for the past 6 years, but we're increasingly focused on gas and gas markets. And so we really specialize in understanding spot demand, and that calculates spot price for block space. And it turns out a lot of the issues that we're talking about here are creating a lot of instability in the gas network, the gas markets, and it's getting worse. We actually have a new finding that we made last week that we're socializing this week that talks about some unexpected interactions between private mempool flow and self-building that's resulting in instability in the base fee that we're all going to need to deal with, timing games, stuff like that. So this is not abstract or theoretical. It's happening right now in the network. So this should be fun.
Who do you think's doing it?
It's a mystery what the cause of this is.
Right. So thanks, Sharding went live, what, beginning of the year, something like that? What did it solve? What problems has it caused? Was it worth it? Should people be advisors on boards? Was it good value for money?
I guess I can go first, right? Whether it's worth it, I think it was definitely worth it, but whether we ship to prematurely without understanding the second order effect, maybe, that I'm not so sure, but it's also hard to foresee the future. I think one thing that we probably didn't really work out in the beginning is that work with layer 2s to understand their blog posting strategy, right? I think currently I will just mention one problem, and I'm sure the rest of the gentlemen also have many problems to add to that, right? Currently the main problem is that as a rollup, the mempool is designed for solo validator for regular transactions users, but people that send rollups, people that send blobs are not regular transactions. They are very sophisticated users, right? So you have this weird behavior that mempool is very strict, but the rollup wants to implement very fancy strategy on sending blobs, and that just doesn't work on regular mempool. That's why we see blob congestion.
Yeah, I would agree with most, if not all, points Terence made. And Terence has also been, we put out some research about some of the effects that we're seeing today right before EIP 4844 was published. It got a lot of attention probably like 2 months after EIP 4844 was already in. And that's kind of the common theme that we see with these large EIPs, that people are aware it's coming, but they don't really wake up to what it does right until maybe it's a big issue. So I agree that we could have taken more time as a community to go through some of the potential issues, maybe have some sort of testnet where these strategies could be tested so that we could tweak the mechanisms on how they work. But it sounds like we're testing that on mainnet, so let's move forward.
Do you think there's a disconnect between core devs, EIP writers, and everybody else?
I mean, I'm not gonna blame it on core devs. I think they do a fantastic job, and it's up to a lot of people to get in touch with them and learn more and interact. But there's just a general disconnect on EIPs and kind of the more technical development of Ethereum versus these end users, whether they're actually like consumers or even more sophisticated ones like blog posters, because they only get to do things when it's already available. And by that time, you're way past the design stage.
Yeah, so I'll take a top-level node operator perspective on that. I think we wanted to see two things, right? So for us to do well as a business, the pie needs to grow, right? More people stake, Ethereum sees use. Then the second side is, well, if our share of the pie grows, we also do a bit better, right? So as far as blobs go, well, we feel good about them if, I mean, it seems very adjacent to the L2 roadmap, if they're seen as a value add by Ethereum. And well, maybe things are getting there. I'm not so super opinionated on this. I think that's probably something that will crystallize. And then secondly, as far as if it gave us any trouble when it was rolled down, well, on the timing game side of things, it definitely made us reevaluate our parameters in a very, very drastic manner. And then, you know, if you run infrastructure, you just see hiccups at different parts of the stack, right? So, yeah.
Could you give us like a quick, like 2-minute overview of what is incentivizing you to behave in the way you're behaving, and how are you behaving?
Yeah, so let's take a step back and think about the PBS auction. Okay, so the PBS auction over the slot, what happens is the expected value of the next block tends to go up as the slot progresses. And we have a public study out because we want to be transparent about these things like timing games, right, and the incentives that people have. So what happens is the value of the block tends to go up linearly with jumps, okay? And the reason for that is that builders have more transactions available, so the combinatorial space is larger. The second reason for that is that statistical arbitrageurs have less inventory risk as the slot nears its culmination. And then there's a third factor as well, which is, well, you know, algorithms run longer and so on, but I don't think that's as significant. So what you're incentivized to do as a node operator is to make sure that you solicit your block in the latter part of this auction, because that's when the curve in expectation is at its highest, right? There's some caveats to that around cancellations and so on. That's the general idea. And we have a study out. It's called the cost of artificial latency, where we talk about negative externalities.
I've read the post. Sorry, Matt.
No, it's all right.
So in terms of the post and what you're talking about there, is it better to, so if you're accepting blocks later in time, do you see a situation where, you know, blocks are smaller, blocks are bigger? Like, you know, what sort of things are you observing? Sorry, that was so Michael, yeah.
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
So in terms of latency games, we're seeing that some blocks get propagated very late in the, you know, in time. Are you seeing smaller blocks being propagated late, or more valuable blocks being, you know, propagated late, when in actual fact there could be a larger block that's being, you know, being built?
Yeah, sure. So let's look at let's see what the bottleneck here is, right? So the bottleneck is you have an attestation committee, and you do not know the amount of latency that the attestation committee will introduce. Okay, so reasons for that. One side is network to the attestation committee, right? Okay, well, it's not so hard to get a handle on that, right? So of course, you don't know who's on the committee, so there's a risk, but in general, you have at least a confidence interval, right? And the second factor is different attesters run different hardware, okay? And there might be a couple of Raspberry Pis in there, which, you know, is very commendable, but in that case, you want to send them a smaller block if it's later in the slot. So I would say, yes, this is something that you would observe.
So is it fair to say that block builders are incentivized to send smaller blocks?
I would say it depends on where you are in the slot, and then it depends. Well, you know, if you want a bigger block, you would have to pay more, which I think makes sense because we're asking people to process more, right? So I think, you know, if you look at it from a market lens, it's not illogical.
Yeah, right. Go on, Emma.
So just on 4844, you know, one level massively successful, dramatically reduced prices for L2s to post to the L1, like huge success. Basically make DA free on ETH L1. On the other level, there was an incident a few weeks ago where the blob base fee increased by 8 trillion X in 30 minutes. It's not a typo. Like, it went from 1 Wei to 8,000, give or take, Gwei. And so Wei to Gwei is a billion. Right? So 8,000 billion, that's what it did. That's not a great market. Not a great market, right? Like, there probably are some parameters that could be adjusted to make that kind of a little smoother. Because it turns out that like building a heuristic that takes into account an 8 trillion X increase is effectively impossible, right? And so probably not fully optimized yet, but I think we can sort of adjust those sort of things. But in general, largely effective. But there are all sorts of secondary effects to what we're talking about here, which I think blobs have exacerbated. And in particular, we tend to think about the network as this homogeneous thing that kind of works in this one way, and that's not true at all. Like the reality of the network and the theory of the network deviate quite a bit. And it turns out that like, yeah, given like 91% of all blocks on the network go through MEV boost, right? So most of them, except those like other 8 or 9%, kind of fuck everything else up, okay? And by the way, part of the timing games that get played is the validator and the builder go deeper into the slot, and they actually steal transactions from those altruistic builders. Those altruistic builders follow the rules and everybody else doesn't. They get doubly screwed, triply screwed. And then they create blocks that aren't really like the other blocks, and that introduces instability to the rest of the network, which, by the way, then forces a fat block the next block. And so, by the way, there's like some really interesting things going on where the base fee may not accurately reflect market demand. And that's kind of a problem for everybody. So these are the sorts of things that are playing out that you can only see in production that I think we're going to require some more analysis and research on.
Do you think is anybody doing anything malicious, or do you think it's just a zero-sum game that all the operators are going to abide by?
Oh, I think we don't have any evidence of anything malicious. I just think it's the incentive schemes today sort of biased towards these sorts of action and a whole bunch of negative externalities that weren't anticipated.
For the panel, what incentive schemes, what things do we need to tweak to get the incentives right?
So as far as I know, today, Rob, they want to pay to get in, right? This is not a problem with money. They are done to pay as much as the second price auction to get in their blob. But the problem today is there is this clearing problem that every roll-up, they send one transactions per basically the amount of blobs they want to include, right? For example, Straw sends 1 blob per transaction, Tycho sends 1 blob per transaction, Arbitrum sends 3, Base sends 6, and I think Optimism sends 5, right? So everyone has this weird fixed number, but no one is playing this adaptive strategy with each other, right? So for example, you can think of there's one time that if the Tycho sends 1 very expensive blob with a very high tip, right? But there are still 5 spaces left, but no one else can get in, or I mean, not no one else can get in. Say that someone like Base cannot get in. But if Base had known that, Base would adjust their strategy to 5 blobs so they can fit in the puzzle, right? So the current market is not very efficient in that sense, and no one is like trying to work together. So you kind of becomes this, say today, if the 1 blob gets in, but there's a lot of demand, it becomes a first price auction, right? So your base fee just dropped in the next. So I think today the problem is mostly this clearing price problem.
Yeah, I agree with that. I'm a little biased here because, obviously what we've built with MEVCommit gives you a channel to kind of update, your fee in real time. And with blobs, it's a particular problem because the blob size is very big, right? So in a 12-second slot, you can only send that blob so many times, which limits the number of times you can update your price. And by the time it gets over, it takes so much time to get that blob over that your price can be no longer marketable. No, it's like you're out of the money. So you need some sort of like real-time pricing mechanism, or at least near real-time pricing mechanism, so that you can like really accurately express the value that you're trying to convey over. And ultimately, like at least in our case, you send over the blob once, and then you can just update your fee in real time. The other benefit is, it's that you can do it in an encrypted way, because Espresso's put forward this idea that, hey, what if I can see your blob and I can just like front run you in terms of the price? So then you're kind of getting into these blob gas wars for no reason. Being able to encrypt your fee that you're tipping to the builders is also important in this case. So I think tools like this could be minimally enshrined over time in protocol. With ePBS and some of the latest kind of developments there, we're seeing like methods of how these can kind of come together.
Yeah, so I agree with all what has been said previously, and I want to come back to a couple of motifs, right? One is the clearing price, and then the second thing what we mentioned earlier is that the PBS auction is a curve, right? And if there's an appropriate clearing price, and you have a sophisticated validator that plays timing games, What they would see is that the maximum value of the block, right? There's maybe a little bit of a peak, and then it drops off, because you understand that you can't get the blob through in time through the attestation committee. So the incentives definitely are there if there is an appropriate clearing price to make sure the blocks get solicited precisely during that peak, right? And there can be a margin around it. It needn't be something where you need to be super sophisticated, right? I mean, if there's an appropriate clearing price, maybe like a certain time duration which people, can land in. Then I think the other thing I want to pick up is on the pre-confirmation side of things. Well, the universe where there's pre-confirmations, as the validator, you know that the blob is coming, and also the blob can get propagated to the attestation committee slightly earlier. So you don't really run the trade-off in the same stark terms.
There's sort of a few issues at play here. By the way, anyone know what blob stands for? Like the L is large, right? Binary large objects. That's where blob comes from. And so this is by definition a large block issue. Two, there's this knapsack problem that we talked about where you have an inventory of 6 available blobs, but it's really inefficient how they get allocated. But how the type 3 transactions that carry the blobs get priced is completely screwed. So it's like, the validator says, hey, I got 6 blobs. And the L2 says, great, I will pay you 1 e to the 6 times the number of molecules that you have inside the blob. You're like, wait, what? Like, that's literally how they're priced. Like, it's not like price per blob. Like, oh, there's 6 blobs, there's 6 prices, we'll bid for that. By the way, there's a whole bunch of debate. Max is here, he'll tell you all about that, about how that stuff, but the bidding process, how you price it, is massively inefficient today. And so that's something that I think we can probably make smoother and more natural as we go forward.
Do you think there's anything else impacting price discovery around there?
Yes, so there's a major issue with price discovery. So, okay, let's, where does price come from, right? Price is a function of demand. So if everybody can see the demand signal, everyone can agree on what the price is. And by the way, the best venue for price is Bitcoin. Nobody argues about what the current price of block space in Bitcoin is because there's really no complexity there and it's completely transparent. So literally there's zero debate in Bitcoin land about what the price of the next block is, right? But the recent explosion in the blob fee, the demand was entirely in a private venue. The demand that kicked that all off was an Arbitrum, right? There was the layer 0 airdrop happened on Arbitrum. Arbitrum's demand went through the roof, and Arbitrum themselves knew they needed all the blob space, but nobody else did. And so here comes Arbitrum, they're consuming all the resources, everybody else is wondering what the hell's going on, and they start freaking out. Their bidding starts to get out of control. By the way, another little interesting nuance of type 3 transaction replacement is a type 2 transaction, the ones we do every day, have a 10% fee increase. Type 3s have a 100% fee increase. So you want to replace a type 3, you got to double it. And then you got to double it again, right? And so basically you have all these conditions where you have a knapsack problem, you have a private demand problem, you have a fee escalation problem, and when the stars line up, you get out of control escalation of the marketplace. And so that's, again, these are all opportunities, I think, for things to be better. But the net is private demand creates uncertainty in the market that makes volatility go up. That's the issue.
Anybody else? All right. Sounds good. All right, we'll pause for a second. Has anybody got any questions from the audience? No?
Late in the day.
Yeah, it's late in the day. All right. Let's move on to the next question then. So one of the things we've observed at MetaMask was transactions not getting inclusion when they should get inclusion. Who's at fault here? And what do you think is impacting this, specifically when we start thinking about block sizes, timing games, and who's manipulating the market?
Is it block transaction or normal?
Any transaction. So what we've observed is that public transactions that are valid for the next block will get censored for multiple blocks and are perfectly valid to be included in the block, but the block builder does not include them for various reasons. Any takers?
They're not juicy enough for the block builder to consider, right? So the block builder is interested in having the juiciest, smallest payload that it can propagate across the world as much as east as possible. So then you run into this issue of, well, there's a bunch of vanilla transactions here that are never getting included, or at least they're waiting for a block biller that is altruistic or something of that nature. Inclusion list is the go-to solution for this. I do think it introduces some other issues that need to be worked around, but it's a valid solution. I think ultimately it becomes a question about should block billers have the entire optionality on how big their block could be? Could they just have a one transaction block when they want to? Should that be declined by the consensus layer or something like that, right? Could they have a massive block beyond the gas limit if they're able to bribe the network as much, right? So you start questioning the parameters of what the block should be and what the block billers should be allowed to do, right? Today the protocol is fairly strict about that, but the strictness comes from the maximum, not in the minimum. The minimum is as low as you want. You can even miss the slot. So maybe there should be minimums, right, based on some sort of EIP 1559 style escalation. Okay, we're seeing blocks that are 10 million gas in the past 5 slots, so it should be something related to that in the next block, right? So you could have these other rules that are not necessarily forcing the inclusion of transactions, but rules that kind of estimate the expected traffic in the network and kind of hold you to abide by them. Yeah.
I think Murat points on something important, which is the expressivity of the public mempool may not reflect the decisions of the builder. But basically, the builder may be looking at additional parameters which aren't really captured there. And so there's somewhat of a disconnect between there's a small number of builders, at least 33% of all the major builders in the world are here in this room, right? They're quite sophisticated in their operation. And by the way, they may be using things that are like ML generated where you say, why did it say that? You're like, I don't know, it's just a neural network. That's just what happened. I'm not suggesting that is what happened, but it's perfectly possible. And so there is certainly signal in the transaction that affects inclusion that cannot be reduced down to the simple parameters that are present in the mempool. And that, again, is a limitation of the current state of the art.
I mean, this is a hard problem, right? I think the common solution you heard from people is just inclusion list, blah, blah, blah. But it's inclusion list is also not the solution to everything, right? It's so then I would say probably the answer is that the user probably should send more tip, right? Because there is this supply and demand problem, right? And everyone's trying to be as cheap as possible, but unfortunately today, there is this honest behavior, right? As a client definition, the honest behavior is to look through the mempool, sort the gas price, pack the transaction, right? But today we're not at this honest behavior, we're at rational behavior. And as a user, probably should know as well on that.
Do you think there should be a floor price on the priority fee?
I don't think so. I think that's a user demand. I mean, Wallet could recommend it. This may be a UX issue, but I don't think there should be a floor price.
Well, I think this is where pre-confirmations also come into play, because it's not just that your priority fee is high or not high enough, it's that by the time you find out, the block is already done. So with pre-confirmations, at least the signal of whether you're receiving a commitment or not can give you that information. Oh, okay, I do need to increase my my priority fee, and then I will get a commitment. Once I have a commitment, I have at least some sort of economic and reputational guarantee that it will happen. And then, if you're not getting it from a particular builder or something, then, maybe they know something that the other builders aren't at that particular moment. So, surfacing this information earlier than finding out when the block is already confirmed is also, does a lot more to kind of get the UX there in terms of getting your transaction included.
I'm never a believer in, I expect something to happen for free, and then I get pissy when it doesn't, and I demand a refund, and you're like, a refund on what, right? So at least having some incentive there seems to make sense, but at the same time, there can be perverse incentives where now everyone's encouraged to overstate. And so there's basically all sorts of rebate markets now for overstating gas and things like that, and it's like, who's incentivized to do what, and does the user ultimately pay the price? I think at the end of the day, for those of us who've been in the game for a long time, what we desire is an efficient network. And the network is not optimally efficient today. It's arguably grossly inefficient. And so I think the objective should be we want to have an ever more efficient network, and these are mechanisms to do so.
Do you think we should be tweaking the parameters on 1559 for base fee escalation and base fee coming down?
Without any question. So 1559 has the mechanism where the base fee goes up or goes down based on demand, and the maximum the base fee can go up is 12.5%. That's 100% full back block, and the maximum that it can go down is 12.5%, and that's a 0% full block. Now you tell me, what's the propensity of a 100% full block versus the propensity of a 0% full block? Turns out it's way easier to have a full block than to have a 0 block. And so the base fee goes up much easier than it comes down. And so this is where you can start to get displacement in the base fee where it doesn't accurately reflect spot demand. So certainly would seem like there's room for optimization there.
Any other unaligned takes?
I think one thing that comes into play here is the new block time debate, right? And that does not take the EIP 1559 into consideration, because if you have 2-3 second block times, now that escalation is going to happen much faster, but in the same kind of span of time that transactions might flow in. So like with a 2 second block time, let's say it's full blocks, 5 consecutive blocks, they're all full. Now you're looking at like 12% increase on all those blocks. So within a 10-second period, you had an incredible amount of gas price increase that you might have sent your transaction 8 seconds ago, and now it's like already out of the money, right? So these kinds of things really need to be thought through and tweaked as this block size debate and block time debate is coming more into focus.
Sorry, on that one, so one of the things to remember is like the mempool or demand environment is a real-time environment and the block environment is a discrete environment. And so basically what happens is over the course of a slot, pressure builds up. And so basically just imagine like build up, drop, build up, drop, build up. Wait, something happened, missed slot. Ooh, builds up again. And so as you start to tweak the timing parameters, the pressure buildup changes and you can introduce more volatility, right? And so basically what everybody wants is predictability. And there's all these parameters, and as you increase performance, you often increase volatility, which then decreases predictability, which pisses everybody off. So it's somewhat of a devil's bargain.
Right. I think we're at time, almost at time. Probably got 2 questions. Yeah.
So my first question is, how do you think, like, the impact of blobs on different type of math extractions? And second, if it opens up for sort of space auction stuffs and how it just changes the space there? Just if there are like some new market for space auctioning or not? Thank you.
Well, the point that Ben from Espresso made, it was about this blob fee mev that you can do, so you can like see the other blobs in the mempool, front run them, etc., in terms of getting your blob included. And then there's a lot of there's some issues right now where you might have 7 blobs that are being sent to a block builder, but they can only include 6. And how do you pick them? It's not strictly on the fee because the priority fee is kind of left out of the type 3 transaction. So those are the level of kind of MEV you can see today. But I do think it'll increase over time, especially with what was it? It wasn't called inscriptions, but they were like this recreational use of the blob space, blobscriptions. And with that, we saw the blob fee go up a lot. And so I don't think the blob use case is going to be confined to just rollups in the future. As these market dynamics settle a little bit more, we're going to see more of these blobscription type uses. I mean, there could be the first, board blob apes dropped someday, and then you're going to see that type of MEV in that new block space. But yeah, that's the surface of it today, as far as I'm aware.
Yeah, so I have one adjacent take to that. Earlier I said there's a couple of reasons why the expected value of a block goes up during the slot. And one of the reasons I mentioned is because statistical arbitrageurs tend to, bid more aggressively towards the end of the slot because the inventory risk goes down. And then if you have a proper clearing price for blobs, that could mean that the auction terminates a little bit earlier. Again, there's pre-confirmation universe where that might work slightly different, but where the auction might terminate a little bit earlier because that's when you get the most valuable block in expectation, because then if you have it going on again, the block gets too large and you can't push it through the attestation committee. One thing that could happen is statistical arbitrageurs bid a bit more aggressively earlier in the slot, which basically means you have a higher derivative on the curve, right? The curve becomes a bit steeper, and maybe there's also certain opportunities they don't pursue because the inventory risk is too high, right? I mean, conjecture to some extent, but I think that's something that we might see.
I think we can think about blob space as a finite resource. So not only do you have 6 blobs, but you have 128 kilobytes per blob. And so if you're base, you use all of that. If you're Tycho, a base rollup, you use very little of that. So there's been speculation that there'll be a marketplace for like fractional blob aggregation. So if 10 base rollups each need 10% of a blob, you can roll it all together. They get one blob and put it across. Now, it doesn't, current prices, it doesn't really change things too much for them, but it is a much more efficient utilization of available resources. The blob space today is massively underutilized, even in the current market. And that's not great. We'd rather use most or all of it. So it strikes me that there's still a lot of room for expressivity in the market once there's sufficient demand to have a natural price. The market is artificially low right now, so we'll see what happens down the line. So anyways, just some thoughts.
Any other questions?
What are your thoughts on kind of enshrining the PBS auction, and how do you think that will impact kind of base fee and the tip?
Yeah, so I'm one of the 5 authors for like EIP 7732, so that's the Enshrine PBS. So I don't think it changed much in terms of like the fee market per se, right? Enshrine PBS, what it solved is that this trust, right? Today, block proposing is trusted because of the relay in the middle, right? So as a validator, if I want to use a builder, I have to go to the relayer, right? So I have this trusted entity, right? Enshrine PBS just means that instead of trusting this entity, I trust the protocol, right? And then what some benefits of that is like you may have like reduced costs, you may have reduced latency, you may have consensus liveness. If the builder doesn't propose the block on time, you can get unconditional payment, right? And I gave a talk earlier about like you could have this pipelining approach that if you have Enshrine PBS, you can do consensus in the first 6 seconds and execution in the next 6 seconds, right? And then in terms of the gas fee, I don't think it's solved that much. Enshrine PBS does face this problem that currently everyone is processing everything between the 3 to the 4 second mark because that's when the block is released, right? But the Enshrine PBS, what it does is that it kind of even out the processing curve because that you process consensus and then you process execution, right? So in a way, there's more time for the blob to propagate. You have probably like 6 seconds to propagate the block versus today just 1 second. So therefore, the blob inclusion rate may be better. It may be a healthy market, but no one knows. It's too early to say.
We used to be a relay and builder, so I would love to see ePBS happen. I think it's probably healthy for the network and its decentralization, but just at a very high level, today relays are this massive thing that prop up the network and there's no economics associated with them. And so in general, when you move from a centralized service to a decentralized service, it gets slower and it gets more expensive. And so just the rule of decentralization is it will probably be a little bit more expensive to do ePBS than the centralized way that we do things today. There's a lot in the current designs, which I'm not totally up to speed on, to try to minimize that or ensure that, but basically you're going to be asking somebody else to do more work, and that somebody else is not used to doing work for free and won't do work for free.
Any other questions?
Also removed the point that Matt made earlier about these non-MEV boost using validators. We might expect a higher number of validators to use ePBS because it's kind of in protocol and they could just add those block builders directly. So you might get a more consistent view of what the fees are actually reflected in the blocks.
Any final questions? Cool. All right. Please join me in thanking our panel.
Thank you.